The sun over the Wyoming Territory in the summer of 1888 was not a gentle thing. It was a hammer, a forge, an anvil, beating down on the cracked, thirsty earth until the land itself seemed to groan. Dust devils, like restless brown ghosts, danced across the plains, their ghostly fingers scraping against the weathered gray timber of Clara May Thompson's cabin. The house stood alone, a solitary bastion against the vast, unforgiving emptiness, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at a horizon that shimmered with heat and broken promises. Inside, the heat was a physical presence, thick and suffocating. It clung to the rough-hewn furniture, warped the floorboards, and drew the scent of dry pine from the walls. For 3 years, since the day Thomas had been carried home from town, his life spilled into the dust of Main Street over a card game gone wrong. This silence and this heat had been Clara's only constant companions. She was 29, but the grief and the relentless labor had carved lines around her eyes and mouth that belonged to a woman 20 years her senior. Her hands, once soft enough to please a husband, were now calloused and raw from mending fences, hauling water, and wrestling a meager existence from a plot of land that was as stubborn and unforgiving as a mule. Loneliness was a taste in her mouth, like the grit that always found its way into her morning coffee. It was the echo in the cabin when she spoke aloud to the chickens, the vast, empty space in the bed beside her, a cold spot that the fiercest summer sun could not warm. After Thomas's death, the well-meaning pity of the townsfolk had quickly soured into whispers. A widow, alone, on a valuable piece of land with a good well. It made her a target. Men from town, ranchers with roaming eyes, would ride out on the pretense of offering help, their gazes lingering too long, their suggestions layered with a meaning that made Clara's skin crawl. She had learned to be hard, to meet their smirks with a face of stone and, when necessary, the cold, unwelcoming sight of the shotgun Thomas had left leaning by the door. So she had shut herself away, building a wall of solitude around her heart, brick by painful brick. Thomas had been her first and only. The memory of his touch was a sacred thing, a ghost she refused to betray. The world of men, with its sweat, its rough hands, and its greedy eyes, would remain outside that wall. But the wall was crumbling, just like the south fence of the cattle pen. The spring rains had been a cruel joke, a brief spattering that had promised life and delivered only mud before the sun returned with a vengeance. The well was running low, the pump groaning with each pull of the handle. Her small herd of cattle grew thinner, their ribs showing like washboards beneath their dusty hides. Desperation was a physical ache in her chest, a constant, tightening band of fear. She was losing. The land, the loneliness, the work. It was all winning. One sweltering afternoon, as she struggled to reset a fence post that had rotted through at the base, the heavy timber slipped from her grasp, crashing down and striking a glancing blow against her shin. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up her leg. She collapsed into the dust, tears of pure, undiluted frustration carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. It was too much. She couldn't do it. She couldn't hold on any longer. The farm, Thomas's legacy, was going to be swallowed by the prairie, and she along with it. It was in that moment of utter despair that she saw him, a figure on horseback, emerging from the heat haze like a mirage. He wasn't riding fast, just a steady, patient plod that spoke of long miles. As he drew closer, she saw he was a stranger, not one of the local men. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, with a slouch that wasn't lazy but weary, as if he carried the weight of the entire territory on his back. He rode a sturdy but unremarkable bay, and he had no pack-horse, just a bedroll tied behind his saddle, a drifter. Clara scrambled to her feet, ignoring the throbbing in her leg, and instinctively reached for the shotgun she'd propped against the fence. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He stopped his horse a respectful distance from the fence, his hands in plain sight on the pommel of his saddle. He wore a dusty, sweat-stained hat that shadowed his face, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. It was a voice that didn't waste words. "State your business!" Clara snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. The shotgun felt heavy and solid in her hands. He took in the scene with a slow, sweeping glance. The fallen post, her disheveled state, the exhaustion etched onto her face. He didn't smile, didn't smirk. He just observed. "Name's Levi. I saw you were having some trouble. I'm looking for work. Don't need much in the way of pay. A roof over my head and a plate at the table is enough." Clara's first instinct was to say no. A man, a stranger. Living here? Unthinkable. It would set the town to talking more than ever. It was dangerous. But then she looked at the fallen post. She thought of the leaky barn roof, the pump that took 100 strokes to draw a bucket of murky water, the endless, back-breaking tasks that awaited her from sunup to sundown. Her pride was a bitter pill, but starvation was worse. "You know how to work?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "Been a soldier? Been a ranch hand? Been a mule skinner?" "I know work," he said simply. There was no boast in it, just a statement of fact. He finally lifted his head, and for the first time, she saw his eyes beneath the brim of his hat. They were a startlingly clear shade of blue, the color of a winter sky, and they held a deep, settled sadness, a look of a man who had seen too much and expected too little. He looked tired, not just from the trail, but from life itself. A bargain was struck, as stark and unadorned as the landscape around them. He could sleep in the barn. He would get 3 meals a day, such as they were. He would work. There would be no liquor, no trouble. He was to keep to himself. He listened to her terms, his expression unreadable, and then gave a single, sharp nod. And so Levi stayed. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm. He was a creature of silence and purpose. He rose before the sun, and the sound of his work was the first thing Clara heard each morning, the steady ring of a hammer, the rhythmic scrape of a shovel, the low murmur of his voice as he soothed the nervous cattle. He worked with an efficiency that shamed her. He reset the fence post in under an hour, his movements economical and sure. He climbed onto the barn roof and methodically replaced the rotten shingles, his silhouette a dark, powerful shape against the pale morning sky. He took one look at the failing pump, disassembled it with a few deft twists of a wrench he produced from his saddlebag, and within a day had it drawing clean, cold water with half the effort. He did it all without a word of complaint, without a request for anything more than what she provided. Clara watched him. She couldn't help it. She told herself she was merely supervising, ensuring the drifter wasn't slacking or plotting to steal her thin cattle. But it was a lie, and she knew it. She was drawn to him, to the quiet competence and the sheer physical presence of him. He was bigger than Thomas had been, leaner, with a corded strength forged not in a blacksmith's shop, but on long marches and hard trails. The Wyoming sun was relentless, and by mid-morning, Levi would often strip off his worn cotton shirt, hanging it on a fence post to dry. The first time he did it, Clara, who had been churning butter on the porch, froze, the dasher still in her hands. His back was to her, a broad expanse of sun-darkened skin, crisscrossed with the faint, silvery lines of old scars. Muscles shifted and coiled beneath the surface as he swung an axe, splitting logs for the stove with a brutal, hypnotic rhythm. She felt a flush creep up her neck, a strange, unfamiliar heat that had nothing to do with the sun. It felt like a betrayal. She quickly turned her back, her heart thumping a guilty rhythm, and churned the butter with a ferocity that left her breathless. But she couldn't stop looking. From the kitchen window, through a crack in the barn door, from the corner of her eye as she fed the chickens. She watched the sweat glisten on his shoulders, the way his dark hair curled at the nape of his neck, the effortless power in his arms as he hoisted buckets of water that she struggled to even lift. A slow, dangerous current was beginning to flow inside her, a thaw in the frozen river of her grief. It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in 3 long years, a deep, primal stirring that both terrified and fascinated her. She would immediately push it down, drowning it in recriminations. Thomas is gone. You are his widow. You will not hunger for the touch of another man. The words were a catechism, a shield against the silent temptation that now slept in her barn. Her nights became restless. The emptiness in her bed seemed to have grown, to have taken on a new, more potent ache. She would lie awake, listening to the sounds of the night, the cry of a coyote, the chirping of crickets, and imagine him just 100 feet away, sleeping in the hayloft. What did he dream of? What battles had left those scars on his back? What sorrows had put that shadow in his winter sky eyes? He was a mystery, a locked room in her own house, and she found herself, to her shame, desperately wanting the key. The strain of it began to wear on her, the constant vigilance, not against him, but against herself, was exhausting. She needed an ally, a buffer. She needed another woman in the house, a presence that would fill the charged silence and stand between her and the dangerous currents Levi stirred. Her thoughts turned to Hazel. Hazel was her half-sister, younger by 5 years, the product of their father's second marriage back east in Missouri. They had never been close, separated by distance and the cool politeness that existed between their respective mothers. But they exchanged letters once or twice a year, polite inquiries into health and harvests. Hazel was unmarried, living with an aunt, and her letters often carried a faint, wistful undertone of wanting something more than her predictable, stifling life. One evening, by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, Clara sat down with a pen and paper. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote. She poured out the hardship of her life, the failing farm, the loneliness, the crushing weight of it all. It was all true, but it was a curated truth. She painted a picture of a desperate woman in need of familial comfort and help. The work is too much for one person. She wrote, I fear I will lose everything Thomas and I built. If you could come, just for a season, it would be the answer to my prayers. She read the letter over, her cheeks burning with the lie of omission. She never mentioned Levi. She described her home as a place of solitary struggle, a fortress of lonely widowhood. She folded the paper, sealed it with wax, and knew she was not just inviting her sister. She was summoning a shield. A week later, a storm rolled in from the mountains. The sky, which had been a merciless, cloudless blue for months, turned a bruised purple gray. The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin, and then the rain came. It wasn't a gentle shower. It was a deluge, a torrent that hammered on the roof and turned the dusty yard into a sea of mud. The storm trapped them. Levi, who had been reinforcing the corral, was soaked to the skin and took shelter in the barn. Clara was confined to the cabin. The rain continued all day and into the night, a relentless drumming that frayed her nerves. She couldn't sleep. The air in the cabin was thick, and the memory of Levi's sun-baked skin, now slick with rain, kept replaying in her mind. Finally, unable to bear the confines of her room any longer, she rose and crept into the main room, intending to get a drink of water. A faint, flickering light from the covered porch caught her eye. The lantern was lit, casting long, dancing shadows. Her breath hitched. Through the window, she could see him. Levi was standing under the narrow overhang of the porch roof, stripped to the waist. The storm had driven him from the barn, and he was using the runoff from the roof, collected in a large rain barrel, to wash. The lantern light sculpted him from the darkness, turning his wet skin to burnished gold. Water streamed down his face, his chest, his scarred back, sluicing over the hard plains of his stomach. He moved with a slow, unself-conscious grace, scooping handfuls of cold water and letting them run over his body. Clara stood frozen in the shadows, a hand pressed to her mouth. This was different from seeing him work in the fields. this was private, intimate. The raw, masculine beauty of the sight struck her with the force of a physical blow. The air left her lungs, the room seemed to tilt, and the slow, heavy throb that started deep inside her was a feeling so long forgotten it felt entirely new. It was hunger, a raw, undeniable wanting that swept away 3 years of carefully constructed grief and denial. She felt a terrifying urge to go to him, to feel the rain and the heat of his skin, to trace the path of the water down his chest. He turned slightly, his profile etched by the lantern's glow, and for a moment she thought he might have seen her. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She stumbled backward, away from the window, melting back into the darkness of the cabin. Her heart was a wild bird trapped in her ribs. She was shaking, not from cold, but from a profound, earth-shattering tremor that had shaken the very foundations of her world. Her back hit the cool wood of the far wall, and she slid down to the floor, wrapping her arms around herself. The image of him was burned into her mind. The water, the light, the skin. It was too much. The wall she had built was gone, washed away by the storm and a single, forbidden glance. She was exposed, vulnerable. From the depths of her panic, a whisper escaped her lips, a frantic, desperate prayer aimed at the man on the porch, at the ghost of her husband, at herself. "Don't touch me there, Cowboy!" 3 weeks after the storm, the stagecoach from Cheyenne arrived in a cloud of alkali dust that was almost as thick as the rain had been. Clara stood on the porch, wiping her sweaty palms on her apron, her stomach a tight knot of anticipation and dread. She had received Hazel's reply a week prior, a short, enthusiastic letter confirming her immediate departure. Now, the moment was at hand. She had gotten what she wanted, a shield, a chaperone, a buffer. So why did it feel like she was awaiting the arrival of a judge? Levi was by the corral, mending a leather strap on a bridle. He'd looked up when the stagecoach first appeared on the horizon, his hands momentarily stilling. He knew who was coming. Clara had told him, her voice clipped and formal, that her sister was arriving to help with the woman's work around the farm. He had only nodded, his face giving nothing away, but she had seen a flicker of something in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe she feared relief. The coach groaned to a halt. The driver, a portly man named Silas, whom Clara knew from town, tipped his hat. "Got a passenger for you, Mrs. Thompson." The door swung open, and a leg appeared, clad in a fine leather boot that looked wholly unsuited for the dusty Wyoming ground. Then, Hazel emerged. Clara's breath caught in her throat. This was not the gangly, quiet girl she remembered from their father's funeral years ago. The woman who stood blinking in the harsh sunlight was younger than Clara by 5 years, but she possessed a self-assurance that made Clara feel ancient. Hazel was ripe. That was the only word for it. Where Clara was lean and hardened by work, Hazel was soft and curved, her figure full and womanly beneath a traveling dress of deep blue broadcloth that must have cost a fortune. Her face was heart-shaped and gentle, framed by auburn hair pinned in a neat chignon, but it was her eyes that held the contradiction. They were a warm, whiskey brown, but they held a shadow, a flicker of old hurts and watchful intelligence that belied her sweet smile. She smelled of lilac water and starched linen, a scent of the East, of civilization that was a stark and sudden intrusion into the farm's familiar smells of dust, manure, and sun-baked pine. "Clara!" Hazel's voice was like honey, and she rushed forward, enveloping her older sister in a hug that felt both genuine and slightly performative. Clara stiffened for a moment before forcing herself to return the embrace, acutely aware of her own sweat-stained calico dress and the roughness of her hands against Hazel's fine fabric. "You came," Clara said, her voice thin. "Of course I came. You needed me," Hazel said, pulling back to look at her. her smile faltering slightly as she took in the lines of exhaustion on Clara's face. "Oh, sister, this place, it's been hard on you." It was then that Hazel's gaze slid past Clara and landed on Levi, who had stopped his work and was watching them. The broken bridle held loosely in one hand. He stood with that quiet stillness he had, but Clara could see the surprise in his posture. He had been expecting, she supposed, another version of herself, not this vision. Hazel's smile returned, but it changed. It became slower, more appraising. "And who is this?" she asked, her voice dropping a little. Clara felt a hot flush of embarrassment. "This is Levi. He's the hired hand," she stammered, hating how weak the words sounded. Levi wiped his hand on his trousers and walked toward them, his boots silent in the thick dust. He took off his hat, revealing his dark, sweat-dampened hair. He looked directly at Hazel, his blue eyes taking in her fashionable dress, her soft hands, the scent that now wafted between them. "Ma'am," he said, his voice that low, familiar rumble. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Levi," Hazel said, extending a gloved hand. It was a gesture of the East, a drawing-room formality that was absurd out here. Levi hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking her hand gently in his own calloused one. Their hands were a study in contrasts, her pale and soft, his dark and hard. The contact lasted only a moment, but Clara felt it like a spark in the dry air. The dynamic of the farm shifted that very afternoon. It was as if a new and unpredictable element had been introduced into a fragile chemical equation. Hazel was not the meek, helpful presence Clara had envisioned. She was a force. She explored the cabin with a bright curiosity, her fingers tracing the rough-hewn furniture, her nose wrinkling slightly at the lingering smell of bacon grease. She unpacked not one, but 2 large trunks, revealing a wardrobe of dresses, lace-trimmed chemises, and silk ribbons that seemed to mock the stark functionality of Clara's life. Clara had offered her the small spare room, little more than a storage closet, which Hazel accepted with a smile, immediately setting about transforming it by hanging a small, silver-backed mirror and laying a lace doily on the crate that served as a nightstand. And she talked, after 3 years of near silence. The cabin was suddenly filled with chatter. Hazel asked about everything, her questions a constant, bubbling stream. She was particularly interested in Levi. "Where did you find him, Clara? He's not from around here, is he?" she asked that first evening as they sat down to a meager supper of beans and cornbread. "He was just passing through," Clara said, her eyes fixed on her plate. "He's very quiet, isn't he?" Hazel said, glancing at Levi, who ate with his usual focused economy, seemingly oblivious to her scrutiny. "But he looks strong, like he could lift this whole cabin if he put his mind to it." A small, playful smile touched her lips. Levi didn't look up, but Clara saw the muscles in his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. From that day on, Hazel made Levi her project. She would take him a dipper of cool water when he was working in the sun, her fingers brushing against his as he took it. She would sit on the porch steps while he repaired a wagon wheel, peppering him with questions about his past. "Were you really a soldier? Did you fight the Indians? Is that where you got those scars on your back?" Her questions were direct, almost brazen, but she asked them with such a sweet, innocent expression that it was impossible to take offense. Levi, for his part, remained frustratingly opaque. He answered her in monosyllables, his gaze fixed on his work. Yet Clara, a student of his silences, noticed a change. There was a new tension in his shoulders, a watchfulness in his eyes when Hazel was near. He was aware of her, every moment of every day, and Clara was aware of them both. A bitter, unfamiliar poison began to seep into Clara's heart. Jealousy. It was a shameful, ugly thing, and she hated herself for it. She had no claim on Levi. He was a hired hand. She was a grieving widow, loyal to a ghost. She had invited Hazel here to be a barrier, but instead, her sister had become a bridge, forging a connection with the very man Clara was trying to keep at a distance. She would watch them from the kitchen window, a dish rag clutched in her fist. She saw the way Hazel laughed, a bright, musical sound that made Levi's rare, fleeting smile appear. She saw the way Hazel would lightly touch his arm to make a point, a casual, intimate gesture that made Clara's own skin tingle with a phantom sensation. Each glance, each shared smile, was a small twist of a knife in Clara's gut. It was a cocktail of forbidden emotions, shame for wanting a man who wasn't her husband, anger at her sister for her effortless charm, and a deep, aching loneliness that was somehow worse now that she was no longer alone. The hunger she had felt that night in the storm was still there, but now it was soured with resentment. She was starving, and she was watching her sister feast. One sweltering afternoon, the heat in the cabin became unbearable. Hazel announced she was going to take a wash, in the absence of a proper bathing room. They used a small, sectioned-off corner of the main room, with a sheet hung from a rope for privacy. It was a flimsy, pathetic arrangement, but it was all they had. Levi was on the porch, sharpening an axe blade, the rhythmic shing-shing-shing of the whetstone a constant, grating sound. Clara was kneading dough, her movements jerky and aggressive. "Could you fetch me another bucket of water from the well? Levi? This one's nearly empty." Hazel called from behind the sheet. Her voice was light and airy. "Yes, ma'am," Levi rumbled, and Clara heard the scrape of his chair as he got up. He walked past the kitchen doorway, the empty bucket swinging from his hand. He didn't look at Clara, but she felt his presence pass like a wave of heat. He was gone for several minutes. The sound of the pump handle groaning filled the silence. Inside the cabin, Clara heard the rustle of clothing, the soft splash of water. The sheet that served as a curtain was thin, and with the afternoon sun slanting through the western window, it transformed into a screen. A silhouette appeared, soft, rounded, unmistakably female. Just as Levi stepped back onto the porch, his shadow falling across the doorway, Hazel moved behind the screen. The light caught her just so, turning the thin cotton sheet translucent. For a single, searing moment, her form was clearly visible, the curve of her hip, the swell of her breast, the long line of her back as she bent to sponge herself with the water. Levi stopped dead in the doorway. The full bucket of water hung from his hand. Forgotten. He didn't move, didn't breathe. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes, those clear winter sky eyes, were fixed on the silhouette. He was utterly captivated. Clara saw it all. She saw the image on the screen, and she saw the look on his face. It was a look of raw, unguarded fascination, of a deep, masculine hunger that he made no attempt to hide. He was drinking in the sight of her sister, and in that moment, something inside Clara shattered. The moment broke when Hazel shifted, and the silhouette dissolved back into a vague shadow. Levi seemed to jerk back to himself. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and without a word, he placed the bucket of water just inside the door and retreated from the porch, disappearing toward the barn as if fleeing a fire. Clara stood by the table, her hands covered in flour, her body trembling with a rage so potent it made her dizzy. She wanted to scream. She wanted to rip the sheet down. She wanted to throw Levi out into the dust and send Hazel back to Missouri on the next stagecoach. But she did nothing. She stood rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming force of her own pain. The knowledge that he looked at Hazel that way, a way he had never, would never, look at her, was a new and exquisite form of torture. That night, sleep was an impossibility. The air was still and hot, thick with the scent of approaching rain and unspoken tensions. Clara lay in her bed, staring into the darkness, her mind replaying the scene from the afternoon over and over. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Levi's face, his eyes fixed on the shadow of her sister. She felt a familiar, cold dread creeping into her heart. the feeling of being replaced, of being left behind. It was the same feeling she'd had as a child when her father had brought home his new wife. The same feeling that had haunted her after Thomas's death. The feeling of being utterly and completely alone, even when surrounded by people. Sometime after midnight, unable to bear the suffocating confines of her room, she slipped out of bed. She needed air. The house was silent. A sliver of moon cast a pale, ghostly light through the window. She moved to the front door, easing it open without a sound, and stepped onto the porch. And then she saw them. They were sitting at the far end of the porch, their backs to her. Hazel was on the top step, and Levi was sitting on the floor of the porch, leaning against a post. They were close, their shoulders almost touching. The space between them was charged, intimate. They weren't speaking loudly, but in low, hushed tones, a murmur that was carried away by the night breeze. Clara couldn't make out the words, but she could see the way Hazel was leaning toward him, her head tilted. She could see the soft glow of the moonlight on her sister's hair, as Clara watched, frozen in the doorway. Hazel laughed softly, a sound that was for Levi alone. Then she shifted and looked up at him, even from a distance, in the poor light. Clara could see the look in her sister's eyes. It was a direct, unambiguous invitation, an offering. That was it. The final thread of Clara's control snapped. A raw, ragged sound tore from her throat. It wasn't a word, just a noise of pure anguish. They both started, turning to see her standing there, a wraith in a white nightgown, her face a pale mask of fury in the moonlight. "Get out!" Clara whispered, her voice shaking with a violence that terrified her. Levi was on his feet in an instant, his face a mixture of shock and something else, guilt. Hazel remained on the step, her expression unreadable. "Clara," Levi started, taking a step toward her. "I said, get out!" she screamed, the word ripping through the quiet night. "Take your things and ride out. I don't want you here. I don't want to see your face ever again." He stopped, his face hardening. He held her gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, thick with broken things. Then, without another word, he gave a curt nod, turned on his heel, and strode toward the barn. The sound of his footsteps faded into the darkness. Hazel rose slowly and came toward Clara. "Sister, you don't understand." But Clara wasn't listening. The anger, so hot and fierce a moment before, had vanished, and in its place was a vast, black, empty chasm. The strength fled from her limbs. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the porch floor, burying her face in her hands. A great, shuddering sob racked her body. She was crying for Thomas, for her lost life, for the impossible hunger that Levi had awakened in her. But most of all, she was crying because she had done it again. She had pushed away the only other human presence in her desolate world, and she was alone, utterly, completely, and finally, alone once more. Hazel knelt beside her, her hand surprisingly gentle on Clara's shaking shoulder. "Shh," she murmured, stroking her sister's hair. "Shh, Clara, it's all right. I'm here." Hazel's comfort was a strange, confusing thing, but in her despair, Clara clung to it, sobbing until she was empty and exhausted. Later, much later, when Clara had finally cried herself into a fragile, hollowed-out peace and stumbled back to her bed, Hazel stood for a long time in the quiet cabin. She looked at her sister's closed door, then toward the barn. A look of quiet determination settled on her face. She smoothed her dress, took a deep breath, and walked out into the night. The barn was dark, but a single lantern cast a low, golden light from the hayloft. She climbed the ladder, her movements silent and deliberate. Levi was there, his bedroll already packed. He was sitting on a hay bale, his back to her, staring at the far wall. He didn't turn as she approached. She stopped just behind him, The air was thick with the scent of hay and horse and his own masculine scent of sweat and leather. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, she reached out a trembling hand and laid it flat against the center of his broad, scarred back. She felt the hard muscle flinch beneath her palm. He still didn't move. She leaned closer until her lips were almost touching his ear. Her voice was a bare whisper, a silken thread in the vast silence of the barn. "Do you want me to stay, Cowboy?" Levi did not leave. Hazel's whispered question hung in the hay-scented air of the barn, a tangible thing. He didn't turn around, didn't answer. He simply sat, a great, still mountain of a man, his back a rigid wall against her hand. After a long moment, she withdrew her touch, and with a quiet sigh that was part frustration and part sorrow, she descended the ladder, leaving him alone in the lantern's glow. He remained there until the lamp burned itself out, and the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the cracks in the barn wall. When he finally emerged, his bedroll was gone. But he was not. He simply went to the well, washed his face, and began his morning chores as if nothing had happened. Clara, watching from the kitchen window, felt a confusing mix of relief and fury. He had stayed. For Hazel. The thought was a shard of glass in her heart. The days that followed were a quiet, simmering hell. A silent truce had been declared, but the house was a battlefield of unspoken words and charged glances. Levi was a ghost, moving through his tasks with a grim, relentless efficiency. He spoke only when necessary, his answers to Clara's instructions clipped and impersonal. With Hazel, he was just as quiet, but the silence was different. It was a heavy, watchful thing, crackling with awareness. Hazel, for her part, had changed tactics. The playful, overt questioning ceased. In its place was a campaign of quiet, persistent intimacy. She began to anticipate his needs. She would leave a jar of cool water on a fence post near where he was working. She started taking an interest in mending, sitting on the porch in the evenings, her needle and thread flashing as she repaired a tear in one of his shirts. She would ask his opinion on things, the best way to stake the tomato plants, whether a particular cloud formation promised more rain. Her questions were innocent, but her proximity was not. She would stand a little too close, her lilac scent a constant, subtle assault on the air around him. She would let her fingers linger when she passed him a tool. Levi was a man caught in a vice. He had spent years building walls around himself, burying the man he'd been, the soldier, the man who had known loss so profound it had scoured him hollow, under layers of calloused indifference. He had come to this farm seeking nothing more than oblivion, a place to work until he was too tired to think or feel. But these two women, in their vastly different ways, were chipping away at his defenses. Hazel was a fire, bright and warm and dangerously alluring. He was a man, and his body responded to her nearness with a primal instinct he had long suppressed. He felt the pull of her soft curves, the promise in her whiskey-brown eyes. When she was near, he was acutely aware of the scent of her skin, the rhythm of her breathing. He found himself watching the way she moved, the effortless grace in her hands as she sewed. It was a simple, straightforward hunger, and a part of him, the lonely, starved part. Wanted to give in to it, it would be easy. But then there was Clara. Clara was a frozen river, a landscape of grief and pride. She was all sharp angles and guarded eyes. She rarely spoke to him, and when she did, her voice was brittle with a resentment that was almost palpable. And yet, she was the one who haunted him. He saw her in the twilight, her silhouette framed in the doorway, watching the horizon as if waiting for a ghost to return. He saw the profound, bone-deep weariness in her posture as she carried the milk pails back from the barn. He remembered the raw, naked anguish on her face the night she had banished him. It was a pain he recognized, a loneliness that mirrored his own. Her pride was a shield for a wound so deep he was afraid to even guess at its source. While Hazel's presence was a demand on his senses, Clara's was a claim on his soul. He found himself watching her, wanting to understand the source of her sorrow, wanting, to his own astonishment, to be the one to ease it. Clara, meanwhile, was living in a state of suspended agony. She was a spectator at her own slow execution. Every shared glance between Levi and Hazel, every quiet murmur on the porch after she had retired to her room, was another turn of the screw. She tried to hate them both, but the emotions were too tangled. She felt a bitter resentment toward Hazel's easy confidence, her womanly softness that seemed to effortlessly draw the male gaze. But she also saw the flicker of vulnerability in her sister's eyes at odd moments, a shadow that hinted at a story Clara didn't know. She tried to hate Levi for staying, for being a constant, towering reminder of her own forbidden desires. But then she would see him with one of the calves, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle as he checked a splint on its leg, and her heart would ache with a feeling that was dangerously close to tenderness. He was a good man, a quiet, steady, capable man, the kind of man who could make a life in this harsh land, the kind of man Thomas had been trying to be. The thought was a fresh betrayal, and she would punish herself for it by working until her muscles screamed and her mind was blessedly blank. The breaking point came one evening about a week after the confrontation. Levi and Hazel were sitting on the porch steps, not talking, just watching the last of the sun's fire fade from the sky. Levi was carving a piece of wood with his knife, the shavings falling in soft curls around his boots. Hazel was idly braiding blades of grass together. The scene was so placid, so domestic. It felt like a deliberate cruelty to Clara, who watched from the darkness of the kitchen. Levi's knife slipped, and he let out a low curse, shaking his hand. A thin line of red appeared on his thumb. "Oh, you've cut yourself," Hazel exclaimed, her voice full of concern. She immediately scooted closer, taking his large hand in her two smaller ones. "Let me see." Clara watched, her blood turning to ice, as Hazel examined the cut with a furrowed brow. She then, without a moment's hesitation, lifted his thumb to her lips and gently sucked the blood from the wound. It was a small thing, an instinctive, almost motherly gesture, but in the charged silence of the farm, it was an act of shocking intimacy. Levi went absolutely still, his entire body rigid. He stared down at the top of Hazel's auburn head, his expression unreadable. Clara couldn't breathe. She turned away from the window, pressing a hand against her churning stomach, and fled to the solitude of her room. This had to end, all of it. The next morning, she waited until Levi had gone out to the far pasture. She found Hazel by the chicken coop, scattering feed. "I want you to leave," Clara said, the words coming out flat and cold, devoid of the rage she had felt the night before. Hazel stopped, letting the feed scoop fall to her side. She looked at Clara, and for the first time, Clara saw not a rival, but a woman who looked deeply, profoundly tired. "You don't mean that," Hazel said quietly. "I do," Clara insisted. This arrangement isn't working. I want you to take the next stagecoach back to Missouri." "And what about you?" Hazel asked, her voice soft but insistent. "You'll stay here, alone, working yourself into an early grave. You think that's what Thomas would have wanted?" The mention of his name was like a physical blow. "Don't you speak his name," Clara hissed. "Why not?" Hazel took a step closer. "Because you're afraid you're forgetting him? Or are you afraid you're not?" "You don't know anything," Clara whispered, her resolve crumbling. "I know that I got your letter," Hazel said, her voice filled with a sudden, fierce emotion. "I know I read the words you wrote, but I also read the words you didn't, the desperation, the loneliness. I know what that feels like. Clara, I know it better than you think." Her facade cracked, and the story came tumbling out. She hadn't just been living with an aunt in Missouri. She had answered an advertisement, a mail-order bride, for a handsome shopkeeper in a town just west of St. Louis. He had sent her a photograph of a smiling, kind-faced man and letters full of promises of a good life, of a family. She had packed her 2 trunks, filled with her hopes, and traveled for 3 days to meet him. The man who met her at the station was 20 years older than his photograph, with mean little eyes and the smell of cheap whiskey on his breath. There was no shop. He was a gambler who had lost what little he had. He'd wanted a wife, but what he'd really wanted was a housekeeper and a nursemaid for his 2 sullen children, all without the expense of wages. He'd kept her for a month of humiliation and misery, before he'd lost her in a card game to another man. She had fled in the night, with nothing but the clothes on her back and one of her trunks, and made her way back to her aunt's, broken and ashamed. "When I got your letter," Hazel finished, tears glistening in her eyes, "I thought maybe this was a second chance, not just for you, but for me, for us, to build something, a home, a safe place." Clara stared at her sister, speechless. The woman she had seen as a seductive, carefree rival was a mirage. Beneath the surface was a deep well of pain and betrayal that mirrored her own. "But Levi," Clara finally managed to say, "you and him." Hazel looked down at her hands. "I saw the way you looked at him, Clara, and I saw the way he looked at you. Like 2 starving people looking at a loaf of bread they're both too proud to reach for. I thought maybe I could build a fire between you, get something started." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "But I got cold, too, and he's a warm fire to stand next to." She looked up, her gaze direct and pleading. "I don't want to take anything from you, I swear it. I came here because I want all 3 of us to be happy." The words were so absurd, so contrary to every rule of society and decency, that Clara could only stare. 3 of us. Happy? The idea was insane. And yet there was a strange, heartbreaking sincerity in Hazel's eyes. She wasn't trying to steal Levi. She was trying to build a family out of broken pieces. That conversation changed nothing and everything. The tension remained, but its character shifted. Clara looked at her sister and saw not a rival, but a fellow survivor. She looked at Levi and saw not just a temptation, but a man caught between 2 damaged women. The situation was no less painful, but it was now layered with a reluctant, aching empathy. A few weeks later, a cold, unseasonable rain began to fall. It started in the afternoon and continued relentlessly into the evening, turning the world outside into a gray, sodden misery. A calf from their small herd, born late in the season, had taken ill, despite their efforts to keep it warm and dry in the barn. Its breathing grew ragged. That evening, it wandered out of the barn and collapsed in the far pasture. Clara, seeing it from the window, didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy oilskin slicker and plunged out into the storm. Hazel's frantic calls for her to wait lost in the wind. The mud sucked at her boots, and the cold rain plastered her hair to her face. But she pushed on. The calf was a fragile life, a tiny flicker of warmth in the cold, and she would not let it be extinguished. She found it, shivering and weak, and somehow managed to heave the small animal onto her shoulders. The journey back was a nightmare. She slipped and fell twice, the calf's dead weight driving her to her knees in the mud. By the time she stumbled back into the lantern light of the barn, she was soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard she couldn't speak. Levi took the calf from her without a word, his expression grim. He laid it on a bed of fresh hay while Hazel ran to the house for warm blankets. Clara stood there, dripping and shaking, a deep, invasive cold seeping into her very marrow. "You need to get inside," Levi said, his voice rough with concern. She tried to nod, but her body wouldn't obey. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and the barn began to tilt. She felt Levi's hands on her arms, steadying her, and then the world went black. When she woke, she was in her own bed. The storm still raged outside, but a fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light on the walls. She was wearing one of her own dry nightgowns, and she was wrapped in a mountain of blankets. But the cold was still there, a deep, internal chill that no fire could touch. She began to shiver again, her body racked with violent, uncontrollable tremors. The bedroom door opened, and Levi entered. Carrying a steaming mug, Hazel was right behind him, her face pale with worry. "She's burning up," Hazel whispered. Levi put the mug down and placed the back of his hand against Clara's forehead. His hand was rough and calloused, but it felt blessedly cool against her feverish skin. "The cold's gone deep," he said, his voice low. He looked at the pile of blankets, then back at her shaking form. "It's not enough." He looked at Hazel, a silent question in his eyes. Hazel simply nodded, her expression one of complete trust, and then she quietly backed out of the room, closing the door behind her. Clara watched him, her mind a feverish haze. What was he doing? He pulled a chair close to the bed, sat down, and then began to unbutton his shirt. He shrugged it off, revealing the familiar landscape of his chest and arms. Then he began to unlace his boots. "No," Clara managed to whisper, the word a faint puff of air. "What are you doing?" "You're freezing, Clara," he said, his voice gentle. He pulled back the blankets. The cool air hit her, and her shivering intensified. Before she could protest further, he slid into the bed beside her, pulling the blankets up over both of them. The shock of it was overwhelming. His body was a furnace next to her icy skin. He was careful not to press against her, just lying beside her, a wall of living heat. But it wasn't enough. Her shivering continued, each tremor a violent convulsion. With a quiet sigh, he shifted, turning onto his side to face her. "I'm sorry," he murmured. And then he reached out and drew her against him. Her back was pressed against the solid wall of his chest. His arm came around her, his hand resting on her stomach. The contact was electric. Every inch of her body was screaming. This was wrong. This was a betrayal of Thomas, of everything she had held sacred. But oh, the warmth, the steady, profound, life-giving warmth. It began to seep into her, pushing back the edges of the bone-deep chill. He held her like that for a long time, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm against her hair. The violent shivering began to subside, replaced by a fine, continuous tremor. He must have felt it. "I just want to keep you warm," he whispered, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. She should have pushed him away. She should have screamed, but she was too weak, too cold, too tired of fighting. A single hot tear slid from her eye and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Then another, soon. A quiet, desperate sob escaped her lips. The sound was one of utter desolation, the cry of a woman who had been alone in the cold for far too long. His hold on her tightened almost imperceptibly. His hand, which had been resting on her stomach, began to move. Slowly, hesitantly, he began to stroke her back, his large hand moving in a long, soothing line from her shoulder down to the small of her back. The touch was not invasive, not demanding. It was a simple, human gesture of comfort. But for Clara, it was a cataclysm. 3 years, for 3 years, no man had touched her with anything approaching tenderness. The feel of his hand, firm and warm through the thin cotton of her nightgown, was an unbearable sensation. It was setting off sparks along her spine, waking every nerve that she had forced into dormancy, the pent-up hunger, the desire she had so violently suppressed, rose up in a tidal wave, swamping her shame, her grief, her fear. A shudder ran through her, but this one was not from cold. It was a deep, visceral response to his touch. He felt it. His hand stilled for a moment, and then his fingers splayed, pressing gently into the curve of her waist. He shifted, his body molding more closely to hers. She could feel the hard muscle of his thighs against her, the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. He was no longer just a source of warmth. He was a man. Panic, sharp and blinding, sliced through the fog of fever and burgeoning desire. This was too much, too fast. This was a chasm, and she was falling. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she twisted in his arms, pushing against his chest with both hands. "No!" she gasped, her voice raw. "Get out!" He immediately released her, his expression a mask of confusion and hurt. He looked down at his own hands as if they had betrayed him. Without a word, he swung his legs out of the bed, stood up, and pulled on his shirt. He didn't look at her again. He just walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the fire, the storm, and the ghost of his warmth. She curled into a tight ball, the shivering returning with a vengeance, and cried until she fell into a restless, fevered sleep. Hazel found him sitting on an overturned bucket just outside the stable, staring into the rain-swept darkness. The storm was beginning to break, but the wind still howled, tearing at the loose boards of the barn. He didn't seem to notice the cold or the damp. He just sat there, a portrait of dejection, his broad shoulders slumped. She came up behind him silently. He didn't acknowledge her presence, but she knew he was aware of her. She didn't speak. There were no words for this. Instead, she sat down on the muddy ground behind him, wrapping her arms around his middle and resting her cheek against his broad, solid back. It was not a gesture of seduction. It was one of pure, unadulterated comfort. It was an embrace that said, "I am here. We are the same. You and I. We are the lonely ones." He didn't pull away. He just let out a long, shuddering breath and leaned back slightly, accepting the small measure of warmth she offered. They sat like that for a long time, two solitary figures in the dying storm. And then a new sound joined the howling of the wind, a sharp, violent crack, followed by the terrifying shriek of splintering wood. A huge gust of wind, a final, furious gasp from the storm, had ripped a section of the stable roof clean off, sending timber and shingles flying into the night. Inside, the horses screamed in terror. In an instant, they were both on their feet, the quiet moment of shared comfort shattered. They ran into the stable, where the terrified animals were rearing and kicking in their stalls, their eyes white with panic. Working together in the frantic, wind-whipped lantern light, they fought to calm the horses. Levi moved with a fearless calm, speaking in a low, soothing voice as he dodged flying hooves. As he was trying to lead the most panicked of the geldings out of its splintered stall, a loose roof beam, swung by the wind, crashed down, striking him a glancing blow on the side and sending him stumbling to his knees. Clara, who had just emerged from the house, drawn by the noise, saw him fall, forgetting her fever, her fear, her pain. She ran to his side. "Levi!" he grunted, pushing himself up, one hand pressed to his side just above his hip. "I'm all right," he bit out, his face pale in the lantern light. "Help me with the horses." Together, the three of them worked, a strange, desperate trinity united against the chaos. They led the frightened animals into the relative safety of the main barn, their personal dramas forgotten in the face of the immediate crisis. When the last horse was secure, the adrenaline faded, leaving behind an aching exhaustion. They trooped back to the cabin, soaked, muddy, and bone-weary. "Let me see your side," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm, once they were inside. "It's nothing," Levi protested, but he winced as he moved. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to a chair by the fire. He obeyed, his usual stoicism giving way to a weary submission. Hazel quietly brought the medical kit and a basin of warm water. Clara knelt before him. "You'll have to take off your shirt." He hesitated, his eyes meeting hers for a long moment. Then he slowly, painfully, pulled the wet, muddy garment over his head. The lantern light flickered over his skin, along his ribs. Just above the waistband of his trousers was a long, angry-looking scrape, already beginning to swell and bruise, It wasn't a deep cut, but it was ugly. Clara took a clean cloth, dipped it in the warm water, and wrung it out. Her hand trembled as she reached out to clean the wound. This was different from the fevered, desperate touch in the bedroom. This was a duty, a necessity. But as her fingers made contact with his skin, a jolt went through her, as sharp and sudden as a lightning strike. His skin was warm, alive, solid beneath her touch. She could feel the hard muscle of his abdomen tense as she gently dabbed at the raw flesh. She focused on the task, her gaze locked on the wound, trying to ignore the sheer, overwhelming intimacy of the moment, the smell of his rain-soaked skin, the quiet sound of his breathing, the heat that seemed to radiate from him in waves. Her hands shook, but she didn't stop until the wound was clean. The morning after the storm was unnaturally quiet. The sky, scrubbed clean by the wind and rain, was a vast, indifferent blue. The world smelled of wet earth and shattered pine. The three of them moved through the wreckage of the farm in a silent, exhausted dance. They propped up the collapsed section of the corral fence, gathered the scattered shingles from the stable roof, and cleared the fallen branches from the path to the well. They worked together with a grim, unspoken efficiency, a team forged in crisis, but the space between them was a chasm of unspoken things. Clara's fever had broken during the night, leaving her weak and hollowed out, but her mind was sharp with a cold, brittle clarity. She watched Levi as he effortlessly hoisted a heavy beam that she and Hazel couldn't budge together. The bruise on his side was a dark, ugly bloom against his skin. She remembered the feel of that skin under her trembling fingers, the solid, living heat of it. The memory sent a tremor of shame and a deeper, more dangerous shiver of longing through her. She watched Hazel, who moved with a quiet competence, her face set in lines of concern, her eyes constantly flickering between Clara and Levi, a silent shepherd trying to keep her broken flock together. That evening, after a meal eaten in near-complete silence, Clara finally spoke. The words felt like stones in her mouth. "You can stay," she said, her gaze fixed on a knot in the wooden table. She did not look at Levi, but the words were for him. "The roof needs to be rebuilt. The harvest is coming. I'll need the help." She felt, more than saw, him look up. The silence in the room deepened, waiting. "You can stay," she repeated, finally forcing herself to meet his eyes. His face was unreadable, a mask of weary patience. "Until the first snow. 1 season." She took a breath, the next words costing her more than all the others. "But there are conditions, a rule. You will not touch me, not ever again, and you will not be with Hazel. Not under this roof. This is my husband's house." It was a desperate, pathetic attempt to reestablish a boundary that had already been washed away, to rebuild a wall that had already crumbled. She was drawing a line in the mud, and she knew it. Levi held her gaze for a long time. She saw a flicker of pain in his blue eyes, a deep, weary sadness, but he simply nodded. "I understand," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. Hazel, who had been sitting with her hands clenched in her lap, let out a breath she seemed to have been holding all day. She looked from Clara's stony face to Levi's shuttered one, and the hope in her own eyes flickered and dimmed. This was not a victory. It was merely a stay of execution. And so began the season of the long silence. The farm became a place of ghosts and invisible walls. The three of them coexisted in the small cabin, their lives interwoven by the relentless demands of the land. Yet they were as separate as 3 distant stars. Meals were agonizing affairs. The only sounds, the scrape of cutlery on tin plates and the chirping of crickets outside the door. Clara would speak to Levi only to give instructions about the day's work. Levi would answer with a clipped, "Yes, ma'am." Hazel tried, at first, to fill the silence with chatter, but her words would wither and die in the oppressive quiet. And eventually, she too succumbed to the unspoken pact of distance. The physical space of the farm became a map of their fractured relationship. The barn was Levi's territory. The kitchen was Clara's. The porch became a kind of neutral ground where Hazel would often sit alone, mending clothes, her posture a portrait of loneliness. The work was a blessing and a curse. It was a reason for them to be near one another, and a reason for them not to speak. Clara and Levi worked together to repair the stable roof, passing timber and hammers back and forth, their hands sometimes brushing, a jolt of lightning in the humid air. They would both pull back as if burned. Clara would feel a hot flush creep up her neck, and Levi would clench his jaw, his focus on his work becoming ferocious. From the ground, Hazel would watch them, her face a sad, knowing mask. Clara was caught in a constant, churning state of inner turmoil. A part of her, the practical, desperate part, was grateful. With Levi's strength and skill, the farm was not just surviving. It was beginning to thrive. The fences were strong, the stable was secure, and the fields were properly irrigated for the first time in years. This small measure of security, this easing of the constant, grinding fear of failure, was a balm to her soul. But every moment of peace was poisoned by the sight of him. He was a constant, living embodiment of her own weakness, her own forbidden desires. She would watch him from afar, her heart a painful knot in her chest. She saw the fundamental goodness in him, the quiet patience he showed the animals, the way he would stop and look at a sunset, a brief moment of stillness in his relentless motion. And it made her ache. Hazel was the most enigmatic of them all. She adhered to Clara's rule with a fierce, almost militant discipline. She and Levi were never alone together in the house. Their conversations were brief, public, and practical. But Clara was not a fool. She saw the glances that passed between them when they thought she wasn't looking. She saw the way Hazel's hands would still in her lap when Levi entered a room. The way Levi's gaze would soften for a fraction of a second when he looked at Hazel. There was a current flowing between them, a deep, subterranean river of understanding. And it was a river from which Clara was excluded. The jealousy it sparked was a low, constant fever, leaving her weak and resentful. The long, hot days of late summer bled into one another. The air grew thick and heavy with the promise of the harvest and the weight of things unsaid. The pressure in the small cabin was building, becoming as tangible as the heat. Something had to break. It happened on an evening when the sun was a great, bleeding wound in the western sky. The heat of the day had been oppressive, and the air was still and close. They had just finished a particularly grueling day of clearing a new patch of land, and they were all sweat-stained, exhausted, and on edge. "I'm going down to the creek to wash the dust off," Hazel announced into the silence of the supper table. "It's too hot to breathe in here." She looked at Levi. "You should come too. The water's cold." It was the first time in weeks she had addressed him so directly, so personally. It was not an invitation for intimacy, just a simple, practical suggestion. Levi hesitated, his eyes flicking to Clara. Clara said nothing, her gaze fixed on her plate, her knuckles white where she gripped her fork. Her silence was its own answer, a cold wall of disapproval. Levi pushed his chair back. "Good idea," he said, his voice neutral. He stood up, took his hat from its peg by the door, and followed Hazel out into the twilight. Clara sat alone at the table for a long time, the food on her plate growing cold. The sound of their footsteps faded, followed by the soft nicker of the horses as they were led from the corral. She could hear the creak of saddle leather. They were riding. A poison, dark and potent, filled her. Where were they going? What were they doing? Her rule, not under this roof, seemed a pathetic, foolish thing now. The world was larger than her husband's house. She was seized by a terrible, self-destructive compulsion. She had to know, she had to see. She slipped out of the house and, keeping to the shadows of the outbuildings, made her way to the low ridge that overlooked the winding path to the creek. The air was beginning to cool, and the sky was a riot of color, deep orange, blood red, and a bruised, dusky purple. She crept to the edge of the ridge, her heart hammering against her ribs, and looked down. She saw them. They had left the horses to graze by the water's edge and were standing near a large cottonwood tree. They weren't speaking. Levi was staring out across the plains, his profile a hard, stoic line against the fiery sky. Hazel stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself, watching him. The scene was one of quiet, shared solitude. There was nothing improper, nothing to confirm Clara's ugliest fears. A wave of relief, followed by a hot flush of shame for her own suspicions, washed over her. She should leave. She should go back to the house and grant them this small, innocent moment of peace. She started to turn away, but a small movement from below caught her eye. Hazel had taken a step closer to Levi. She reached out, not to touch him, but to gently pull a dry leaf from the shoulder of his shirt. It was a small, tender gesture. Levi turned his head to look at her. He didn't smile, but the hard lines of his face seemed to soften in the dying light. Hazel looked up at him, and the setting sun caught the unshed tears in her eyes. "I'm so tired, Levi," she whispered, her voice carrying faintly up to the ridge. "I'm so tired of all this." He looked at her, and in his eyes, Clara saw a depth of empathy and understanding that stole the breath from her lungs. He saw her pain. He understood her loneliness. He reached out and, with a hesitation that spoke volumes, he gently cupped her face in his hand, his thumb stroking her cheek. And then he leaned down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion. It was slow and deep and profoundly sad. It was a kiss of shared sorrow, of two lonely souls clinging to one another in the wilderness. It was a kiss that acknowledged the impossibility of their situation. From her vantage point on the ridge, Clara saw their two dark silhouettes merge into one against the backdrop of the blazing sunset. The sight broke something deep inside her. It was a clean, final snap. This was the truth she had been running from, the truth she had come here to see. It was a truth that burned more than any lie. A dry, ragged sob escaped her lips. The sound was small, but in the quiet evening air, it was as loud as a gunshot. Down below, Levi and Hazel sprang apart. Levi's head whipped around, his eyes scanning the ridge. He saw her, even from that distance. She felt the force of his gaze. She saw the shock, the guilt, and the despair that flooded his face. Clara turned and fled. She scrambled back from the ridge, not caring about the noise she was making. Branches scratching at her face and clothes. She just had to get away. She ran, blindly, tears streaming down her face, back toward the sanctuary of the house, the only place she had left. She had almost reached the porch when she heard his voice, hard and commanding, behind her. "Clara, wait!" She ignored him, fumbling for the latch on the door. But he was faster. His hand closed around her upper arm, his grip firm but not brutal. He spun her around to face him. Hazel was a few paces behind, her face pale and stricken in the gloom. "Let me go," Clara choked out, trying to wrench her arm free. "No," he said, his voice low and raw. "You're not running. Not this time. You're going to listen." "I saw what I needed to see." She spat, the words tasting like ash. "You've made your choice. Now get your hands off of me." "There was no choice to make," he said, his voice rising with a desperation she had never heard from him before. He let go of her arm, but he stood in front of her, blocking her path, a great, immovable obstacle. "Can't you see? Don't you understand what this is?" "I understand that I am a fool," she whispered, her anger collapsing into a black pit of despair. "I understand that my husband is dead, and his farm, his house, his life is being taken over by the two of you." He took a step closer, his face inches from hers. The last light of the day glinted in his eyes, and she saw in them a torment that mirrored her own. "Nothing is being taken. Clara, look at me." He waited until her tear-filled eyes met his. "You think this is about her, about choosing? This has never been about choosing." His voice dropped to a raw, ragged whisper, filled with an impossible sincerity. "I would do anything to stop this pain, to stop your pain, to stop hers." He gestured back at Hazel. "I am a man caught in a flood, and I am trying to save everyone from drowning. If I thought for 1 second it would bring peace to this house, if it would make you happy, I would get on my knees right now. For both of you." The words hung in the air between them, shocking and blasphemous and utterly, heartbreakingly sincere. Clara stared at him, her mind unable to process what he was saying. For both of you, it was not a proposition. It was a confession, a cry of a man stretched on a rack, willing to do anything to stop the turning of the wheel. She had no answer. There were no words for this. She simply stood there, trembling, as the twilight deepened into night around them. The walk back to the cabin was a funeral march. The three of them moved as separate entities, united only by the profound, agonizing silence that enveloped them. Inside, the fire had burned low. No one moved to light a lamp. They undressed for bed in the darkness, the rustle of their clothes the only sound. Clara lay in her bed, her body rigid, her mind a maelstrom. Levi's words echoed in her ears. For both of you. It was a sentiment so far outside the bounds of her understanding, of the world she knew, that it terrified her. She had wanted a simple villain, a straightforward betrayal. Instead, she had been given a problem with no solution, a knot with no end. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, when the moon was high and casting a pale, silver light through the window, her bedroom door creaked open. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. It was Hazel. "Get out!" Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. Hazel didn't move. "No," she said, her own voice soft but firm. "No more running, not for any of us." She crossed the room and sat on the edge of Clara's bed. She reached out and took Clara's hand. Clara tried to pull away, but Hazel's grip was surprisingly strong. "He meant what he said," Hazel murmured. "He is drowning, Clara, and so are we." "What do you want from me?" Clara cried, her voice breaking. "I want us to stop fighting the current," Hazel said. She stood up, gently pulling Clara by the hand. "Come with me." "No, Hazel, no!" But Hazel was insistent. She led us stumbling, resisting Clara out of the bedroom and across the main room, to the small, curtained-off alcove where Levi slept on a simple cot. He wasn't asleep. He was sitting on the edge of the cot, his shoulders slumped, a figure of utter desolation in the moonlight. He looked up as they entered, his face a mask of weary resignation. He knew. He had been waiting. Hazel led Clara to the side of the cot. She did not let go of her sister's hand. She looked from Clara's terrified face to Levi's broken one. Then she took Levi's hand, his large, calloused, capable hand, and placed it over Clara's. She pressed them together, sandwiching her sister's trembling hand between both of theirs. The warmth from their skin enveloped her. "I don't want to divide," Hazel whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I want to share." The words, so simple, so impossible, shattered the last of Clara's resistance. A great, shuddering sob broke from her, a sound of 3 years of grief and loneliness and fear and forbidden hunger finally being released. She sank to her knees by the cot, her hand still held fast between theirs. Levi slid off the cot to kneel in front of her, his other hand coming up to gently touch her hair. Hazel knelt beside her, her arm wrapping around her sister's shaking shoulders. They stayed like that for a long time, 3 broken people kneeling in the moonlight, clinging to one another. There were no more words. There was only the sound of Clara's weeping, the steady warmth of their hands, and the profound, earth-shattering feeling of surrender. It was not a surrender to passion, not in that moment. It was a surrender to a truth that was larger and more terrifying and more beautiful than any of them could have imagined. It was the surrender of 3 solitary souls to the possibility that they might not have to be alone anymore. It was a night of trembling and tears, and a quiet, radical healing that took place in the silent spaces between their heartbeats. The sun was just beginning to cast a pale, rose-colored light into the room when Clara slowly surfaced from a deep, dreamless sleep. For the first time in 3 years, she did not wake up alone. She was lying on her side in Levi's narrow cot, which they had somehow all ended up in. His arm was around her, his hand resting possessively on her waist, and her back was pressed against the solid warmth of his chest. His breathing was a slow, steady rhythm against her hair. She felt safe. The feeling was so foreign, so powerful. It brought tears to her eyes. She turned her head slightly. Hazel was there, lying on her other side, her head resting on Clara's shoulder, her arm thrown across her sister's stomach. She was still fast asleep, her face peaceful in the dawn light. Levi's eyes opened. He looked at her, and the guarded, weary mask was gone. In its place was a look of profound, quiet wonder. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Clara looked from his face to her sister's sleeping one. They were a tangle of limbs, a strange and impossible family. The world outside, with its rules and its judgments, did not exist in this small, quiet space. There was only the 3 of them. She raised a hand and gently touched Levi's cheek, her fingers tracing the rough stubble along his jaw. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. Hazel stirred in her sleep, murmuring something incoherent and snuggling closer to her sister. A small, watery smile touched Clara's lips. It was the first real smile that had reached her eyes since the day Thomas had died. They said nothing. In the silent, golden light of the new day, they just looked at each other, and for the first time, they were not afraid. The delicate piece they had woven in the moonlight was as fragile as a spider's web, and just as easily torn. In the weeks that followed that transformative night, a new, tentative world took shape within the weathered walls of the cabin. The oppressive silence was replaced by a soft-spoken intimacy. There were shared smiles over the breakfast table, quiet conversations on the porch in the evenings, and an easy, collaborative rhythm to the daily chores. For the first time, the house felt like a home, not a prison of grief. Levi was no longer just a hired hand. He was the solid, steady center around which their small universe turned. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke a language of profound devotion. He would mend a loose step he saw Clara trip on, leave a bucket of wildflowers on the table for Hazel, and his eyes, when he looked at either of them, held a quiet, protective warmth that was a shield against the harshness of the world. Clara and Hazel, in turn, found a new solace in each other. The rivalry was gone, replaced by a fierce, sisterly bond forged in shared pain and a shared, impossible love. They would work side by side in the garden, their hands in the dirt, sharing stories of their pasts, filling in the empty spaces of each other's lives. Their nights were a time of quiet healing. They would often end up together, a tangle of limbs in Clara's larger bed, finding comfort and a profound sense of belonging in the simple, non-demanding closeness. It was a relationship that had no name, no precedent, no place in the rigid, God-fearing world that lay just beyond their property line. It was their own secret, a fragile bubble of peace and acceptance. But they all knew, in the unspoken parts of their hearts, that such a secret could not be kept forever. The outside world intruded, as it always does. During the weekly supply run into town, Levi usually went alone, but with the harvest approaching, they needed more than he could carry on his own, so they hitched up the wagon. As the 3 of them rode into the small, dusty settlement, a change was immediately apparent. Usually, they were met with nods and quiet greetings. Clara was the stoic widow Thompson, an object of pity and respect. Today, they were met with silence. Windows were suddenly filled with peering faces. Conversations on the boardwalk of the general store ceased as they passed. only to resume in hushed, urgent whispers behind their backs. The blacksmith, who normally shared a gruff greeting with Levi, turned his back, suddenly fascinated by a horseshoe. In the mercantile, Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, served them with a cold, clipped efficiency, his eyes refusing to meet theirs. The air was thick with a judgment so palpable it was like a physical pressure. Clara felt a hot, familiar shame creep up her neck. She kept her head held high, her back ramrod straight, but inside she was crumbling. Hazel, however, reacted with a quiet defiance, meeting the hostile stares with a cool, challenging gaze of her own. Levi seemed not to notice, or to care. He moved through the town with his usual unhurried purpose, his presence a silent, immovable rock. But Clara saw the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way his hand never strayed far from the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. He was a soldier again, alert to the threat of ambush. The whispers followed them like flies. The widow and her family? Shameless, living in sin, right under God's own sky. The words were like small, sharp stones thrown from the shadows. By the time they loaded their supplies and turned the wagon back toward the farm, the fragile peace of their home had been irrevocably shattered. They rode in silence, the weight of the town's condemnation a fourth passenger in the wagon. 3 days later, the town came to them. They arrived in the late afternoon, a grim delegation silhouetted against the sun. There were 4 of them. In the lead was Reverend Miller, a tall, gaunt man whose piety was a weapon he wielded with relish. Beside him was his wife, a woman whose face seemed permanently puckered in disapproval. Flanking them were 2 of the town's elders, stout, self-important men who saw themselves as the guardians of local morality. They rode not in a wagon, but on horseback, as if they were a posse coming to dispense justice. Levi saw them first. He was repairing the corral gate, and he straightened up, his body going still and watchful. "Clara, Hazel," he called out, his voice low and calm, but with an underlying edge of steel. "Stay in the house." The 2 women came to the doorway, their faces pale. The sight of the approaching riders sent a chill of dread through Clara's heart. The delegation reined in their horses just outside the newly repaired gate. They did not dismount. They sat in their saddles, looking down, their face masks of grim, righteous certainty. Levi walked slowly to the gate, stopping on his side of the property line. He did not invite them in. He simply stood there, his arms crossed over his broad chest, and waited. "Mr. Levi," the Reverend began, his voice a sonorous boom that was better suited to a pulpit. "We have come on a matter of grave importance, a matter of the immortal souls of this household." Levi said nothing. His silence was more unnerving than any shouted defiance. "A dark rumor has reached our ears," the Reverend continued, warming to his theme. "A rumor of depravity, of a den of iniquity established in what was once a good Christian home. We have come to put an end to it." "This is private property, Reverend," Levi said, his voice flat. "You have no business here."
"The business of the Lord is every man's business," one of the elders boomed. "We will not stand by while you corrupt these 2 women."
Mrs. Miller, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her voice a high, piercing whine. "We have come to save them, to return them to their proper place. This is an abomination in the eyes of God and man." "Their place is here," Levi said, his voice dropping, each word a stone. "With me." The Reverend's face flushed with anger. "You will leave this place, sir. You are a drifter, a vagrant, a source of moral infection. You will pack your things and ride out, and you will not return. The good people of this community will see to the welfare of Mrs. Thompson and her sister." Levi slowly uncrossed his arms. He took a step closer to the gate, and the 4 riders instinctively pulled their horses back a step. The quiet, watchful man had vanished, and in his place was a figure of cold, unshakable authority.
"Let me make this plain," he said, his voice no longer flat, but ringing with a quiet, deadly force that cut through the afternoon air. "You are not welcome here. What happens on this land, in this house, is not your concern. These women," he paused, turning his head slightly to glance back at the cabin, where Clara and Hazel stood watching, frozen in the doorway. The look he gave them was one of fierce, absolute possession. Then he turned back to the riders. "They are my family. This is our home, and I will not be leaving." He rested his hand on the top of the gatepost, his knuckles white. "If you want me gone, you'll have to carry me out, and I promise you, some of you will be coming with me. So I suggest you turn your horses around and ride back to town and tend to the sins in your own houses." His eyes, cold as a winter sky, met the Reverend's. Now, for a long moment, no one moved. The air crackled with tension. The Reverend's face was a mottled purple, a mixture of fury and shock at being so directly challenged. He looked at Levi's stance, at the unwavering certainty in his eyes, at the hand that rested so casually near his gun, and he saw a man who was not bluffing. He saw a man who had faced down death before and was not afraid to do so again. With a sputtering curse, the Reverend yanked on his reins, turning his horse so sharply that it reared. "You will burn for this," he shrieked, his voice cracking with impotent rage. "All of you!" And with that, he and his delegation galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and the stench of their judgment hanging in the air. Levi watched them go, his body rigid. He did not relax until they were a distant speck on the horizon. Then he turned and walked back toward the house. Clara and Hazel met him on the porch. The confrontation was over, but the battle had just begun. The words of the townsfolk echoed in Clara's mind. Den of iniquity, abomination, corrupt. They were branding irons, searing her with a shame so profound it made her feel physically ill. Hazel was trembling, but her eyes were bright with a defiant anger. "How dare they?" she whispered. "How dare they come here and speak to us that way?" The days that followed were a siege. They were isolated, cut off. No one from town came near them. When Levi rode in for essential supplies, he was openly shunned, served only after every other customer had been attended to. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were open insults, hurled from a safe distance. The ugliest words were reserved for the women. One day, a group of boys on horseback rode past the edge of the property, shouting taunts. They called Hazel a harlot, a painted woman from the east come to spread her wickedness. They called Clara an unclean thing, a widow who had defiled her husband's memory. Hazel absorbed the insults with a stony face, but Clara saw her late at night, weeping silently into her pillow. Clara, however, felt the words burrow deep inside her, confirming her own worst fears about herself. The guilt she had held at bay came roaring back. She was the cause of all this. She had brought Levi here. She had invited Hazel. She had allowed this impossible situation to take root. She was the one who was defiled. She saw the strain on Levi's face, the constant, weary vigilance in his eyes. He was a sentry, guarding them day and night, but the emotional toll was immense. She saw the fading hope in Hazel's eyes. This wasn't the safe harbor she had dreamed of. It was a fortress under attack. One night, as the three of them sat by the fire, the silence heavy with unspoken fear, Clara came to a decision. She had to be the one to end it. She had to sacrifice herself to save them. She waited until Hazel had gone to bed. Levi was banking the fire for the night. "Levi," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He turned, his face etched with weariness in the firelight. "This is my fault," she said, the words a painful confession. "I can't let this happen. I can't let them destroy you both." She took a deep, shuddering breath. There's a way to make it right, in their eyes. He watched her, his expression guarded. "You should marry Hazel," Clara said, the words ripping from her throat. "She's young.
She deserves a proper life, a husband, a family. You are a good man. You could give that to her. Her mind was racing, trying to make the plan sound logical, reasonable. You could leave, the two of you, go somewhere new, where no one knows you. Start fresh. I will be fine. The farm is all I need. It was Thomas's, it should just be mine. It was the ultimate lie, and the ultimate sacrifice. She was offering to cut out her own heart to save the body. She would return to her solitude, her grief, her loneliness. It was a penance she felt she deserved. Levi stared at her, and for a moment, she thought he hadn't understood. Then she saw the look in his eyes, not of consideration, but of a deep, profound hurt. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and stood before her. He did not touch her, but his proximity was overwhelming. "Do you really think so little of me?" he asked, his voice a low, pained rumble. "Do you think I am a man who can just carve you out, discard you?" "It's the only way," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "For their world, it's the only way." "Then to hell with their world," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He reached out, as if to touch her face, but then remembered her rule and let his hand fall to his side. "Clara, listen to me. When I was out there, on my own, I was nothing. A ghost. This." He gestured around the simple, firelit room, a gesture that encompassed her and Hazel and the life they had built. "This is the only real thing I have known in 10 years. You are both. You are everything." He shook his head, a look of fierce, stubborn certainty on his face. "I am not choosing. I will not choose between my heart and my soul. I choose both. I choose this family. I choose us. And if the world outside wants to burn for it, then we will face the fire together." His words, so impossible, so defiant, so full of a love she couldn't comprehend, broke the last of her resolve. She sank into a chair, her face in her hands, and wept. The very next week, a new and unexpected complication arrived in the form of a buckboard from Cheyenne. The man driving it was not a rancher or a preacher. He was dressed in a black city suit and a derby hat, looking utterly out of place. He introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy, a lawyer representing a mining interest in the capital. He had come with astonishing news. The land, Clara's land, sat atop a small but potentially rich vein of silver. A geological survey had been conducted in the area, and his clients were prepared to make a generous offer for the mining rights. The farm, the very ground they stood on, was suddenly valuable, not just for its water and its pasture, but for the wealth that lay hidden beneath it. Clara was stunned, unable to process the information, but Levi understood immediately. He saw the glint in the lawyer's eye, and he understood what this meant. Their moral crime was about to be compounded by the sin of unexpected wealth. The town's resentment, which was already at a fever pitch, would now be fueled by greed. The news spread through the settlement like a prairie fire. The widow Thompson, the sinner, was now the rich widow Thompson. The drifter who was living with her wasn't just a scoundrel. He was a fortune hunter, preying on a vulnerable woman to get his hands on her silver. The narrative was simple, ugly, and easy to believe. The animosity in town curdled into a dangerous, volatile hatred. The breaking point came on a moonless night a week later. They had been on edge for days, the feeling of being watched a constant, prickling presence. Levi had taken to sleeping in the main room of the cabin, his shotgun by his side. The attack came without warning. It started with the frantic, terrified whinnying of the horses in the stable. Then came a shout and the horrifying, whooshing sound of fire. Levi was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the shotgun. "Stay inside! Bar the door!" he yelled at Clara and Hazel as he ran out into the night. Clara rushed to the window. The stable was on fire. Flames were already licking up the dry timber walls, casting a terrifying, flickering orange light across the yard. In that demonic light, she could see them, a group of 5 or 6 men, their faces obscured by bandanas. They were carrying torches and clubs. It was not the town elders. This was the town's ugly underbelly, men fueled by whiskey and righteous greed. She saw Levi charge toward them, a roar of pure fury erupting from his chest. He was a magnificent, terrifying figure, a man defending his home. The first blast from his shotgun sent 2 of the men stumbling back, screaming. But there were too many of them. They swarmed him, coming at him from all sides. He fought like a cornered wolf, using the shotgun as a club, his fists like hammers. But a heavy club caught him on the side of the head, and he staggered. Another blow brought him to his knees. While the others were focused on Levi, 2 of the men broke away and ran toward the house. Hazel, who had been standing beside Clara, screamed as the cabin door splintered under a heavy boot. The men burst in, their eyes wild in the firelight. One of them grabbed Hazel, clamping a filthy hand over her mouth and twisting her arm behind her back. "Got one of the harlots!" he crowed. The other began tearing the cabin apart, looking for money, for anything of value. Everything seemed to slow down for Clara. The terror, the shame, the guilt, it all burned away, replaced by an ice-cold, crystalline rage. This was her home. These were her family. And these men were trying to destroy it all. The man holding Hazel was trying to drag her out of the door, while his partner started pulling out a rope to tie her with. Levi was on the ground, struggling to rise as 2 men kicked him repeatedly. Clara moved. She didn't think. She reacted. Thomas's old shotgun, the one she had once used to keep suitors at bay, was still propped by the hearth. She snatched it up. The metal was cool and solid in her hands. She had never fired it, but she had watched Thomas load it 100 times. Her hands, clumsy with adrenaline, found the trigger. She raised the heavy gun to her shoulder, just as Thomas had shown her. The man who had been ransacking the room turned and saw her. His eyes widened in shock, a sneer forming on his lips. "Looky here, the widow wants to play." He took a step toward her. Clara didn't aim at him. She aimed above his head, at the log wall behind him. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the small cabin. The shotgun kicked back against her shoulder with a brutal, bruising force that almost knocked her off her feet. A chunk of wood splintered from the wall just above the man's head, spraying him with debris. The cabin fell silent. Both men froze, staring at her. The man holding Hazel loosened his grip. Outside, the sounds of the beating stopped. Everyone looked toward the cabin, toward the source of the blast. Clara stood in the center of the room, the smoking shotgun held steady in her hands. Her face, illuminated by the fire from outside, was no longer that of a frightened widow. It was the face of a woman who had been pushed too far. Her eyes were chips of ice. "Get out of my house," she said, her voice low, shaking not with fear, but with a rage so cold it burned. "Get away from my family, now!" She cocked the second hammer of the shotgun. The loud, metallic click was the deadliest sound any of them had ever heard. The sound of the second hammer clicking into place was the loudest thing in the world. It was a sound of finality, a full stop at the end of a violent sentence. The 2 thugs inside the cabin froze, their bravado evaporating in the face of the transformed woman before them. The man who had been holding Hazel let her go as if she were a hot coal, stumbling back a step, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Outside, the men beating Levi fell still, their attention ripped away by the blast and the chilling metallic sound that followed. In that frozen moment, Levi moved, with a guttural roar. He surged upward, not as a victim, but as an avenger. He drove his shoulder into the midsection of the man closest to him, sending him sprawling into the dirt. He spun, his fist connecting with the jaw of the second man with a sickening crack. The man crumpled, unconscious before he hit the ground. The remaining attackers, seeing their friends dispatched and their comrades in the cabin held at bay by a shotgun-wielding wraith, lost their nerve completely. This was not the easy victory they had been promised over whiskey and resentment. This was something else entirely. Just as they turned to flee, another sound cut through the night, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Fast and heavy, a single rider burst into the firelit yard, reining his powerful buckskin to a dramatic halt. It was Sheriff Brody, a man whose weathered face and weary eyes had seen the worst of what men could do to one another. He had been in town, playing a quiet game of cards, when a rancher from a neighboring property, having seen the glow of the fire, had ridden in half-mad with fear of a range war. Brody took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance that missed nothing. The burning stable, the men lying on the ground, the terrified but defiant women on the porch, the wild-eyed thugs, and Levi, standing over his fallen opponents, his chest heaving, blood trickling from a gash on his temple. "That's enough!" Brody's voice was not loud, but it carried the unquestionable weight of the law. It cut through the chaos like a whip. "Everybody freeze!" He swung down from his horse, his hand resting on the butt of his peacemaker. His eyes, like chips of granite, settled on the men. "Drop the clubs! Drop the torches! Hands where I can see them!" The men, caught between the fury of Levi and the authority of the law, complied immediately, their weapons thudding into the dust. Brody's gaze shifted to the cabin. "Clara," he said, his voice softening just a fraction, "you can put that scattergun down now. It's over." Clara looked at him, her mind still reeling. Her arms, trembling from the kick of the gun, felt impossibly heavy. Hazel gently placed a hand on her sister's shoulder, and with a shuddering breath, Clara lowered the shotgun, leaning it against the wall. The strength that had surged through her vanished, leaving her weak-kneed and shaking. Sheriff Brody was a man of grim efficiency. He rounded up the conscious thugs, kicking their weapons away and binding their hands with a piggin string from his saddle. He recognized them all, local troublemakers, men who were always louder and braver in a pack. He hauled the unconscious man to his feet and unceremoniously dumped him over the back of his own horse. Arson, assault, trespass. Brody listed, his voice a low, cold monotone as he cinched the knots. "That's enough to see you boys breaking rocks for a long, long time." He looked over at the fire, which was now consuming the stable with a hungry roar. "And you're lucky if this is all you're charged with." He turned to Levi, his expression unreadable. "You all right, son?" "I'll live," Levi grunted, wiping the blood from his brow with the back of his hand. Brody nodded, then looked at the two women on the porch, his gaze lingering for a moment on Clara's face. He saw not the timid widow he remembered, but a woman of hardened steel. "I'll be back in the morning," he said. "Get a bucket brigade going on that fire before it spreads, and I want a full statement from all three of you." He mounted his horse, took the reins of the others, and with a final, hard look at his prisoners, he led the sorry procession away into the night, leaving behind a smoldering ruin and a silence broken only by the crackle of flames. They fought the fire until dawn, 3 exhausted figures moving through the smoke and haze. They managed to keep it from spreading to the house, but the stable was a total loss, a blackened, skeletal wreck against the pale morning sky. As the sun rose, they collapsed onto the porch steps, covered in soot and grime, their bodies aching, but their spirits strangely unbroken. They had faced the fire, and they had survived, together. Sheriff Brody was true to his word. He returned that morning, not alone, but with a deputy. He took their statements, writing everything down in a small, leather-bound book. He was thorough, professional, and asked no questions about their living arrangements. His concern was the crime, not the gossip that had caused it. Before he left, he stood on the porch, looking out over the valley. "I made a stop at the Reverend's house on my way out here," he said, not looking at them. "And I paid a visit to the saloon. I made it clear, what a man does in his own home is between him and God. But what a mob does with torches and clubs is between them and me. There won't be any more trouble of this kind. You have my word." The sheriff's warning, backed by the very real threat of federal prison for the arrested men, was effective. A new invisible line had been drawn around the farm, a line of law that was stronger than any fence. The town's open hostility subsided into a sullen, resentful silence. They were still outcasts, but they were no longer targets. The attack, however, had crystallized something for Clara. The farm was no longer just a legacy to be preserved. It was a home to be defended, and the silver was no longer a complication. It was a weapon. That very week, she sent a letter with a trusted freight driver to Mr. Abernathy in Cheyenne. The lawyer returned within a fortnight. The deal they struck was a shrewd one, guided by Levi's quiet, practical counsel. Clara did not sell the land outright. She sold the mining rights to a specific, limited section of the property, far from the house and the well. The sum she received was not a vast fortune, but it was more money than she had ever imagined seeing in her life. It was enough. The money changed everything. It bought them security. They hired 2 men, quiet, capable ranch hands that Levi knew from his drifter days, men whose loyalty was to the paycheck, not to town gossip. They rebuilt the stable, not with salvaged timber, but with new, strong lumber from a mill in the next county. It was larger and better built than the original. They bought a small herd of healthy new cattle and 2 fine new horses. The farm, which had been a place of constant, desperate struggle, began to transform into a place of quiet, solid prosperity. The work was still hard, but it was no longer overwhelming. With the extra hands, Levi could focus on managing the farm, Clara on the house and garden, and Hazel, who had a surprising knack for numbers, on the account books. Life settled into a new rhythm, a rhythm of healing and rebuilding, the invisible wounds from the attack, and from the years of loneliness that had preceded it, slowly began to scar over. The fear that had been a constant companion in the house was replaced by a sense of safety, of belonging. The heat of summer mellowed into the crisp, golden days of autumn. The cottonwood leaves by the creek turned a brilliant yellow, and the air grew sharp with the scent of pine and coming frost. They brought in the harvest, a bountiful one, filling the new barn with hay and the root cellar with vegetables. They had built a fortress, not just of timber and fences, but of shared work, shared struggle, and a shared, unspoken love. One clear, cool morning, when the sun was casting long shadows across the frost-kissed fields, Levi came to them on the porch. He was holding a small, clumsily wrapped package. He looked nervous, a rare sight for such a stoic man. "Walk with me," he said, his voice quiet. He led them out, away from the house and the outbuildings, to the middle of a wide, open pasture. The sky above was a vast, cloudless blue. The mountains on the horizon were a sharp, purple line. This was their sanctuary, the heart of their kingdom. He stopped and turned to face them. He took a deep breath, his eyes moving from Clara's face to Hazel's. The love in his gaze was so open, so profound, it was almost painful to look at. "I don't have much of a way with words," he began, his voice a low rumble. "I've spent most of my life letting my hands do the talking for me, and most of what they've had to say has been about fighting and surviving." He looked down at his own calloused hands, then back up at them. "But with you, I've learned something new. I've learned what it means to build, what it means to have a home. Not just a roof, but a place to put your heart." He fumbled with the package, his big hands clumsy with the string. Inside was a small, velvet-lined box. He opened it. Lying inside were 2 identical rings. They were simple bands of polished silver, unadorned and beautiful in their simplicity. Then he did something that shattered the last, remaining vestiges of Clara's old world. He knelt there, in the dirt of the pasture, a tall, strong man making himself small before them. He looked up, his face filled with a raw, vulnerable sincerity that took their breath away. He took a ring in each hand. "There's no preacher," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "There are no laws written for us. There are no words in any holy book that can name what we are." He looked at Clara, then at Hazel. "I only know what is true in here." He touched his chest. "I know the world doesn't accept this. I know they look at us and see sin. But I look at us, and I see salvation. I see my family." He held out one of the rings to Clara. "Clara May Thompson," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "You took in a ghost and gave him a reason to live." Then he turned, still on his knees, and held the other ring out to Hazel. "Hazel," he said, his voice soft, "you came here looking for a safe harbor, and you built one for all of us." He looked between them, his heart in his eyes. "I can't give you a name that the world will recognize. I can't give you a piece of paper that will make this right in their eyes. All I can give you is my life, my strength, my heart." His voice dropped to a vow, a sacred oath sworn under the open sky. "I vow to protect you, to honor you, to work for you, and to love both of you for all the days of my life." Hazel was the first to break. A great shuddering sob escaped her, a sound not of sadness, but of a joy so profound it was painful. Tears streamed down her face as she reached out and let him slide the silver band onto her finger. Clara watched, her own eyes blurred with tears. The last of the ice around her heart, the final, frozen shard of grief for the life she had lost, finally melted away. She looked at this impossible man, kneeling in the dirt, offering a promise that no law would recognize but that she knew, with every fiber of her being, was more true and more binding than any preacher's words. She looked at her sister, her face radiant with tears, and she felt a love so fierce, so expansive, it filled the vast emptiness inside her. A small, watery smile touched her lips. It was a true smile, one that reached her eyes and crinkled their corners, the first of its kind in over 3 years. She held out her hand, and Levi slid the matching silver ring onto her finger. It felt cool and solid and right. He rose to his feet, and the three of them stood there in the middle of the field, the silver on their fingers catching the bright morning sun. Hazel took Clara's hand, and Clara took Levi's. They stood in a small, unbroken circle, their hands joined, a strange and perfect trinity against the vast, empty landscape. They had no name for what they were, but they had a home, and for the first time, for all of them, it was enough. The seasons turned. The first snows fell, blanketing the farm in a quiet, pristine white, and then melted away to reveal the green promise of spring. The world of the town remained distant, a place of resentful memory, but the world within their fences was one of peace. On a warm evening in late spring, they sat together on the wide, rebuilt porch. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in brilliant strokes of crimson and gold. The air was soft, fragrant with the smell of lilacs from a bush Hazel had planted and the rich scent of damp earth. Hazel sat in a rocking chair, a piece of embroidery in her lap, her needle moving with a quiet, contented rhythm. She was humming a soft, tuneless song. Clara sat on the porch swing, a book open in her lap. Though she wasn't reading, she was simply watching the colors of the sunset, a look of serene peace on her face. Levi sat on the top step, leaning back against a post, in his lap a small, scruffy orange cat, a stray that had wandered in from the wilderness a month ago and decided to stay, was purring loud enough to vibrate through the wood of the porch. Levi stroked the cat's fur with a slow, gentle hand, his gaze moving between the two women and the vast, beautiful land that spread out before them. This was his life. This was his home. This was his peace. He was no longer a drifter. He had arrived. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the three of them sat in the deepening twilight, a small island of quiet contentment in the vast, wild heart of the West. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We're curious to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let us know. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Clara, Hazel, and Levi's journey. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. From Wild West. For more tales from the frontier.